Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this Sunday's show. Up first, satellite imagery out west here. A couple of disturbances, one tracking northeastward here from the eastern Aleutians right on up across the Alaska Peninsula and in toward Bristol Bay. And then a bigger storm out here bringing some storm force winds and rain into the central Aleutians. And up over the interior, we've got a thing right through here bringing some light snow and breezy conditions to the along the Yukon River there into the Kuskokwim Valley down to the western Alaska Range now. Otherwise, east and south of the mountains there, lots of clear skies occurring all the way down, just about total sunshine here across the area into Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island. But north and west of the range there, we've got areas of light snow continuing here up in the central interior down toward Northway. And looks like maybe a little break up here over the Yukon Flats area. Then some more clouds there with some snow and gusty winds over the eastern Arctic coastal areas. And then down here over the Panhandle, we've got a system here tracking eastward, pretty strong low pressure area as it pulls in, kind of deepening as it approached the Queen Charlotte Islands there. Winds gusted to 75 miles an hour along the west coast of the islands there, and not so much up to the north, a little gusty, but winds on the increase over in the northern Panhandle up to 35 gusts, 50 miles an hour to the northeast there. As drier air pushes in, clear skies now reported at Juneau. And this will continue to just pull off and a slow end to the shower activity over the southern southeast coast. There's a low center this afternoon having pulled eastward there. The strong northwest winds on the back side of that, tightening gradient over the northern Panhandle, bringing in those drier, somewhat cooler air and definitely the sunshine with it. Lots of sunshine, as I mentioned, along the North Gulf Coast. And over the Valdez, seeing gusts 45 miles an hour out of the east and northeast today. And Kodiak Island earlier seeing a gust of 45 miles an hour. But as this narrow ridge axis moves eastward, those winds are already starting to come down about 35 miles an hour this afternoon. And same thing over the through Whittier there. Winds diminishing there as well, pretty gusty, but again, the clear skies. And then this trough out here to the west, bringing an area of light snow. Actually, a couple inches of snow as that moved by across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta with some light snow extending from just about Iliamna Lake there, mostly along the western Alaska Range, northern Kuskokwim Valley, back up toward Nome, where they had a couple inches of snow. And some light snow throughout the day, brought anywhere from trace to maybe an inch or two up in the Tanana Valley there. And some gusty winds and very light snow for the eastern Arctic coast with that weak system there. Otherwise, this system here, as it came across, had a little more punch to it than the one up here to the northeast did. Gusts to 45 miles an hour at Cold Bay as that passed through, and even, let's see, even stronger winds there at the King Cove area, trying to think of that, or no, False Pass had gusts of 52 miles per hour and some wind up into the Pribilof Islands, and then winds gusting to 65 miles an hour with about a half inch of rain at AKwx with this system as it pulls northeastward. And we'll see tonight that the low center tracks northeastward and the front edges eastward here. So gale and storm force winds in store for the Aleutians tonight, spreading in toward the eastern Aleutians there. This trough continues to weaken as it pushes northeastward slowly. Some moisture in the form of shower activity may push across Kodiak Island, and lingering light snow here along the southwest coast. But snow and blowing snow on the increase. St. Lawrence Island late tonight. Stays variably cloudy. Those clouds, some may get across the Alaska Range into Cook Inlet, or they may not. But most of the moisture will kind of slip on up into the central interior here. So areas of light snow and snow showers pretty widespread over the central interior from Eagle on out to the Seward Peninsula. North of that, though, under high pressure, mostly cloudy skies and light winds there for the northern Koyukuk-Kobuk valleys across the Brooks Range, light winds all the way to the Arctic coast. And gusty winds may see gusts up to 50 miles an hour or so through Lynn Canal. And drying out now down over the southern Panhandle by late tonight or after midnight, all that shower activity will be off to the east or southeast. And then we'll see tomorrow, lots of sunshine here for the Panhandle, locally gusty winds and out of the east and northeast there in the usual channeled areas, and variably cloudy to partly sunny for south central Alaska, North Gulf Coast, but winds pretty light. Still a little bit of light snow activity there in the upper Tanana Valley 40-mile country, but that's really diminishing from what it had been. And increasing clouds here in the west, this front bringing snow, blowing snow, blizzard conditions, winter storm warnings out, Yukon Delta, St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast, Norton Sound, and eventually on up into the Kotzebue Sound area there. But it'll stay dry with some clearing, especially on the eastern north slope. A little bit of a break here between this system and the next one pulling in tomorrow afternoon, bringing increased wind, rain, and snow into the western Aleutians, more rain into the central Aleutians with winds on the increase late tomorrow and tomorrow evening. Looks like storm force winds here come across the Aleutians tomorrow night, and that low tracks quite rapidly up to the northeast, and this front pushes up as well, and looks like the snow and blowing snow will make a little farther eastward here into the interior on Tuesday. Pretty good gradient here, so definitely snow and blowing snow coming into the Yukon lower and mid Yukon River Valley areas, back up across the Kobuk, Selawik Valley, Noatak Valley, northwest coast, Cape Lisburne, Point Hope could see winds gusting 50 to 70 miles an hour by late in the day there, with snow and blowing snow extending down, improving behind the front here for St. Lawrence Island. And then look for some rain into the Kuskokwim Delta and into the southwest interior with that warmer southwest flow behind this warm front there, and maybe even into the southern Kuskokwim Valley, looking at mixed precipitation there. Some of that spilling across the Aleutian Range, maybe into Shelikof Strait, but not so much for Kodiak Island. Should be a dry day, especially on the east side of the island there. Trough with some rain for the eastern Aleutians. Another pretty potent trough, swinging some increase in the winds, rain and snow as that colder air comes down from the northwest there, from the Kamchatka Peninsula area. Otherwise, over the eastern interior, central and eastern interior, looking pretty good through Tuesday. See a definite big increase in the clouds, thickening and lowering clouds in the central interior later in the afternoon toward evening, but becoming a little windy there through the passes of the Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast. That should keep it at least VFR with that offshore flow up there. Light winds over the eastern interior, all the way from the Gulf of Alaska up to the eastern Brooks Range, and sunshine for the southeast coast here with less wind now, but just solid sunshine from Dixon Entrance, Queen Charlotte's up into the Yakutat area, and probably the Copper River Basin as well. Looking at low temperatures for tonight, lower 20s northern panhandle, upper 20s to near 30 to the south, mid-teens around Yakutat, and 0 to 10 below there in the Copper River Basin. Kuskokwim Valley, single numbers are 5 to 10, and also for the Sinton Valley, lows anywhere from 5 below to 15 above, warmer down toward Homer, not Nome. We'll get to Nome in a bit here, 28 at Kodiak, and for the highs tomorrow, 30s. Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, southern Kenai Peninsula, and mid-20s for the Kuskokwim Valley, mid-20s south central Alaska, Susitna, Matanuska Valley, teens there for the Copper River Basin, near 30 for Valdez, and 20s to staying below freezing here over the northern half of the Panhandle, and lower to mid or upper 30s toward Prince of Wales Island, followed by lows 5 to 15 over the northern Panhandle on Wednesday morning, lower 20s to the south, and teens south central Alaska, 0 to 10 below for the Copper River Basin, and lower 30s for Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island, followed by highs in the 30s here. Warmer air coming into Bristol Bay, lower 40s for King Salmon and Kodiak, near freezing for Nikolai and McGrath, mid to upper 20s south central Alaska, and highs in the 20s for much of the southeast coast. Up to the north, lows tonight right around 0 central interior, anywhere from 25 to 40 below for the north slope areas, and followed by highs in the teens, milder, pushing up toward freezing there for Nome, but below 0 for the Arctic coast north slope. And again, 25 to 35 below northeast interior. Milder, though, staying above 0 here in the Tanana Valley, and in the 20s out toward the Seward Peninsula area for Wednesday morning, followed by highs 15 to 30 in the central interior, coldest to the east, warmer to the west, and even the Arctic coast pushing above zero for the central and west side. Southwest coast, lows tonight in the 20s, near 30 for the Pribilofs, freezing for Shimei and Attu, otherwise in the 30s everywhere else. Highs 40 to 45 here for the central Aleutians, the Alaska Peninsula, upper 30s for the Pribilofs, upper 30s for the Southwest coast, followed by lows in the 30s and highs in the 40s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather for Tuesday morning, huge area of IFR out here with that storm in the Bering Sea, pushing into the Yukon Delta there, down to Nunivak Island and approaching St. Lawrence Island. Narrow band along the weakening front here in toward just west of Nikolsky. And some IFR to start out here over the northern and eastern interior areas, but VFR, southern Alaska, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, up to the northwest there to most of the Seward Peninsula, most of the North Slope. Marginal VFR there for the eastern central Arctic coast. Good VFR here, North Gulf Coast, Yakutat, right on down to Dixon Entrance. And then for Tuesday afternoon, holds VFR here for the Panhandle, most of southern Alaska. Some marginal VFR may creep up to the western Alaska range in that area there, and then improving, but holding on to marginal VFR for the mid and upper Tanana Valley over toward the border. And this area of IFR progressing inland there, at least up to the Kuskokwim Mountains, marginal VFR spilling into the Kuskokwim Valley, and now getting up north of the Bering Strait to about Shishmaref with increasing marginal VFR over the northwest interior. And out to the west, a band of VFR here from Pribilof south, and then marginal VFR for the Aleutians, and some IFR here with another system starting to approach the Aleutians, but mostly staying to the south through the afternoon. This area right here associated with the main frontal boundary there, associated with that storm in the Bering. And then for Wednesday, doesn't make much eastward progress here except up to the northeast into the Koyukuk Valley, the IFR that is, extending back into Norton Sound, covering northern eastern Bering Sea right up along the coast. A couple of bands extending down across Atka Island, and another one back towards Shimei and Attu, and yet another one up here along the western Arctic coast. Bristol Bay, southern Kuskokwim Valley, looking pretty good VFR-wise for the morning. Same with Cook Inlet, some marginal VFR now. Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, staying good over the eastern interior. Panhandle stays VFR right through Wednesday afternoon. Interior, good VFR from Prince William Sound right up to the eastern Brooks Range. Marginal for the Arctic coast. IFR, though, pushing northeastward here, almost into the central interior areas. Marginal VFR across the western Alaska Range into southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak, Kachemak Bays, Kodiak Island with IFR down toward Akiak and Sitkinak. IFR, Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, right on up to the northern Bering Sea and into the Strait there, Seward Peninsula, IFR. And for the passes, another good day for the Brooks Range, Anatuvik and Adigan, both looking to be VFR, will be VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR for those two passes as well. Now Rainy may have some marginal VFR in the western entrance, otherwise looking pretty good. And Windy could have marginal VFR in the northern entrance, otherwise a VFR day there, especially south. And Isabel, VFR. Mintasta, VFR. Solid VFR for Tanita, and the same thing for Portage. Good VFR either approach there right into Passage Canal from Turnagain Arm. And Chilkoot and White, VFR. Freezing levels coming northward here out over the Bering Sea, almost up to the Russian coast there with a southerly flow with that big storm coming into the Bering, pushing 4,000 feet north of the eastern Aleutians Alaska Peninsula. And more or less hugging the North Gulf Coast across the northern panhandle there like we've seen for the last few days. And going on to icing, none expected of any significance over the central eastern interior to the Arctic coast or the panhandle. Some icing here with that first system coming into the southwest coast and up to the Seward Peninsula, covering the northern Bering Sea, then a break, then some heavier icing beginning to approach the southern, or the to the south of the Aleutians here. The moderate rime icing holding off until probably beyond, well, tomorrow evening, tomorrow night in that time frame. And for the jet stream here, westerly winds, 150 knots right across the eastern Bering Sea in toward Bristol Bay, 110 knots there. across northeast Bristol Bay, almost right over King Salmon, and then northwesterlies here, 100 to 110 knots, blowing right down across Yakutat, and 9,000 feet, westerlies at 80 knots. Here take a turn to the north at about 65 to 75 knots along the west coast, and then 35 to 50 knot winds out of the north to the east there. And 3,000 feet, west winds 70 knots, very windy conditions, northern and eastern Bering Sea into the western interior. And turbulence-wise, if you're anywhere out over the western part of the state tomorrow, you're in for one bumpy ride as well as the illusion.
Space weather affects technologies.
Clear on your final.
As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
The Space Weather Prediction Center has had a long-standing relationship with the power industry, so they've been aware that solar storms, the geomagnetic storm piece of that, can affect the operation of systems and induce extra currents and loads on those systems that can either trip those systems offline or in the worst of cases, cause damage. That relationship goes back for several decades. In fact, a big incident in 1989 where part of Quebec was tripped offline that affected something like 6 million customers for about 9 hours. I think that really raised the awareness in the power industries.
When we get the alert, we watch the grid and start looking for issues. Are we seeing a decline in voltage? Are we seeing equipment failures? And we readjust the system to try to mitigate those problems, try to keep the lights on and keep it from going out.
So averaging about 500, 550 kilometers per second.
If we didn't have this early warning, we wouldn't see it until our sensor saw it. Getting more information quicker and faster before the storm hits, not during the storm, is a big improvement.
In the long term, I think what we need and what we're moving toward, the U.S. as a whole, is better modeling, fully understanding this phenomenon, understanding how it would impact specific systems.
Rather than actually experiencing a storm, we can simulate storms in our software and see what the impact is. We try to get ahead of it. We always plan that if there's an outage, how can we keep the lights on? What's the best process to prevent it?
In the end, 5-10 years from now, there's going to be a whole mix of operational procedures driven by what we do on prediction and warning. And then there also will probably be some level of hardware controls to ensure the reliability of the grid.
Space weather affects technologies.
Clear on your final.
As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
There's different types of impacts on communication systems, and the HF we call the high frequency, which is that band of communications 3 to 30 megahertz. But it's a very important band of radio communication because it's used widespread. It's used, for example, by the airlines.
HF radio is most commonly used for position reporting when you're going across the ocean airspace, which is devoid of radar, and ATC can't see you, so it's up to you to report your position and your altitude and your speed.
HF works great most of the time, except during a big flare. And during a big flare, that HF communication capability could be gone within a minute or two. So as soon as we see something happening in there, or we see a flare, it's one of the first things we do is alert the aviation community, hey, big flare, HF's going to be impacted.
Once we know that there's an event going on, then the aviation industry and the airlines can react to that. They can alter their routes over the poles. They can lower the altitudes that they're flying at, or maybe decide not to fly at all in the interest of the passenger safety.
So that's just one example of how HF is used, but the emergency response community will use it a lot too. It's one of their primary backups.
When you've lost connectivity between certain government agencies, it gives you that long-range coverage to talk from out-of-state to federal governments or from the FEMA locations to the state emergency operations centers.
So if you've got a big hurricane impact in the coastline, whatever big city, we've got the cell towers down and whatnot. We've got emergency communication folks in there. Those folks are very familiar with space weather and how it impacts their systems.
Here in recent years, it was used during Katrina when we had a lot of communications outages down there. It was also used during Hurricane Ike. There was an outage of the telephone circuits with the Texas State Emergency Office, so it was used in both of those situations.
So when we talk about backup, especially for the airlines, typically they'll have SATCOM, so that'll be satellite communication.
The satellite technology that emergency responders use could be GPSs, could be satellite phones, satellite data terminals.
Space weather events can impact SATCOMs. The impact can range from a nuisance to loss of a spacecraft. So we will give them the heads up. If we have space weather events, flares, whatnot, they need to know what's impacting their systems. Situational awareness is key. Time is of essence to these folks. Again, it's life and death.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
North winds 30 knots for the day on Tuesday here for the central and south coast. Seas 15 to 20 feet. Small craft advisories, north winds 25 knots, extreme north coast, and north 30 knots, gale force gusts for Lynn Canal, north at 30 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, north winds 20 knots, but seas at 8 feet. And then lighter winds in store for Wednesday on the south coast here, north 20 to 25 knots, and east to north winds on the north coast at 15 to 20 knots. Small craft advisories for Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, and Stevens Passage for north winds at 25 knots, seas running 4 to 5 feet. North winds at 20 knots for Clarence Strait. And for Prince William Sound tomorrow, northwest winds 25 knots, northwest 25 also for the eastern North Gulf Coast, lighter winds to the west, northwest at 20 here for the west side down to the Barren Islands, and north winds 20 knots, Kamishak Bay, southern Cook Inlet, but north of the Forelands, light northeast breeze at 10. That holds through Wednesday, northern Cook Inlet, northeast at 10 knots, northeast 15 for the southern Cook Inlet area, southeast 15. Kamishak Bay, light southeast wind at 15 knots for the Barren Islands. North Gulf Coast, light southeast winds at 15 knots with seas around 5 feet. Prince William Sound, northeast breeze at 10 knots with slight seas. Kodiak Island, south to southwest winds, 20 knots tomorrow. And gale warnings developing here on the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula out of the south at 40 knots. And small craft advisories for Bristol Bay for southeast winds at 25 knots. And for Wednesday, those winds turn south at 25 for Bristol Bay, and still pretty windy here for the Alaska Peninsula, southerlies 25 to 35 knots. And for Kodiak Island, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. And gale warnings out for the eastern Aleutians. In fact, Adak, Atka, Unmak Island, Unalaska Island, all looking at gales at 40 to 45 knots from the south and mostly southwest. 30-knot westerlies from Kiska Island to Shimia. And then for Wednesday, the next storm actually bringing some storm force winds in across the Aleutians tomorrow night, Tuesday night, and then by Wednesday that low center pulls so far up to the north that the westerly winds come down to about 50 knots out of the west, southwest 50 knot or southwest 45 knots from Chitka Island. Gale warnings, Adak and Atka, Wednesday, southwest diminishing to 35 to 40 knots, and southwest winds for the eastern Aleutians, 30 to 35 knots. For the southwest coast tomorrow, southeast winds 40 knots. Storm warnings for the Pribilof. South winds 50 knots, seas 27 feet. Southeast winds 40 knots, St. Matthew Island and St. Lawrence Island. Even Norton Sound looking at good gales. East winds at 40 knots. And then for Wednesday, southeast 40 for Norton Sound, south 30 for St. Lawrence Island. Gale warnings continue here for the St. Matthew Island area, St. Paul, St. George for southwest at wind 40 knots, 20-foot seas. Southwest 40 also for the Yukon Delta coast. And for the eastern Arctic coast, they're hanging on to a west wind from Barter Island to Demarcation Point at 25 knots. Otherwise, the east side here, pretty light, east at 10, and then the central coast, southeast at 20. Then brisk wind advisories for the western Arctic coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings from Cape Thompson to Wales for east winds at 40 knots. And for the day on Wednesday, from Wales to Cape Beaufort, southeast winds 30 knots. And otherwise, the remainder of the Arctic coast, pretty uniform wind-wise on Wednesday, all out of the east, all at 30 knots. And for tonight, big storm coming into the western Bering here in a strong front, bringing storm force winds and gales with it. And Pribilof Islands, warmer air coming up too with it, so snow changing to rain for the Pribilofs. And rain continues down across the central Aleutian areas, rain and snow showers back to the west. Area light snow here in the central interior. Either side of that, though, dry with variably cloudy skies. Clearing, increasing clear skies for the Panhandle as that low pulls off to the southeast. Tomorrow, sunshine for the Panhandle, a little breezy in areas. Variably cloudy for most of the central and eastern interior to mostly sunny in some locations. And then snow, blowing snow, blizzard conditions pushing into the west coast here, St. Lawrence Island, and up to the northwest there with that front pulling in, but pretty weak in its southern portion. Then another storm comes up, and let me get out of the way here, moves to about this position Tuesday afternoon with another round of snow and blowing snow with that frontal boundary pushing into the western and northwest interior, dry over the east.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.